What the hell do you think you're doing in my son's bed? The voice sliced through the silence like thunder in a children's hospital deep in the heart of Seattle. The rain wasn't gentle anymore. It wasn't background noise. It was fury, pounding against the windows like a war drum. Dr. Jonathan Blake, world-renowned neurosurgeon, a man whose hands had saved hundreds of lives, stood frozen in the doorway, staring. In front of him a woman, a janitor, cradling his son in her arms. Both asleep, still, safe. Long enough for a bruised little heart to finally rest. She didn't flinch. She didn't jump to defend herself. She simply whispered, with a calm that cracked through the storm, he just needed someone to stay, until the nightmares passed. And then Jonathan slapped her. Yes, in the name of protection, in the name of control, in the name of fear disguised as fatherhood. But in that one reckless moment, the moment he thought he was defending his son, he destroyed the only person that boy had finally trusted. Noah, 6 years old, lost his mother in a violent car crash. Hasn't slept through a single night in nearly 2 years. He screams. He bangs his head against the wall. He rejects every form of therapy, 14 therapists, 6 private nurses, 3 residential treatment centers. None of them worked. Until she came along, no degrees, no titles, just scarred hands and a broken heart that had once shattered like his. And then she was gone. No complaints, no protest, no lawsuit. Just a folded note left behind on the edge of a hospital bed. When the world gets too loud, remember the quiet between heartbeats. I'm still there. The story you're about to hear isn't about a doctor. It isn't about a janitor. It's about healing. The kind that happens when someone stays, when no one else would. It's about how a stranger saved a little boy's soul. Not with credentials, but with presence. And it's about a father who had to lose more than once to finally learn the difference between saving a life and holding on to someone's heart. Are you ready? Because after this story, you'll never look at a janitor the same way again. Seattle, the second autumn since she left. Seattle Grace Central Hospital still glowed through the night, as if the word, sleep, had never been invented there. And to be fair, no one really slept. Not in the ICU, not in the ER, and certainly not Noah. Jonathan Blake, 42, was the name whispered with both admiration and caution across every medical board on the West Coast. A neurosurgical genius. A widowed father, a man with golden hands and a heart that hadn't known warmth in years. When Jonathan worked, he became a flawless machine. No delay, no distraction, no emotion. He could remove a brain tumor the size of a grain of rice in under 3 hours. On stage at Harvard, he described weaving a needle through the frontal lobe like he was conducting a symphony. But when he came home, or more accurately, to the empty apartment above the hospital, Jonathan no longer knew how to talk to his own son. Noah was just 6. But his eyes carried grief far too large for any room to hold. Since his mother died, he hadn't truly slept. He'd jolt awake in the middle of the night, curled in corners, screaming words that made no sense. Then silence. Hours, days, no response to questions, no explanations. Just that stare. Jonathan had tried everything. Clinical psychologists, behavioral therapists, music therapy, all the best minds, all the latest methods, and all of them had failed. No one earned Noah's trust. No one stayed long enough. No one stayed until Valerie. She appeared quietly, the kind of quiet that lives in hospital basements, in linen rooms, where no one goes unless there's blood to mop or towels to fetch. She arrived around 10 p.m., made her rounds from room to room, took out the trash, swapped out IV bags, and disappeared into the night. No one noticed her. No one needed to. She was a shadow in the system, and who really pays attention to the shadows? Valerie Cruz once dreamed of becoming a child psychologist. She had made it to her final year. Just 1 thesis and 3 months of internship left. But then she got pregnant, rushed into a marriage, and met a reality no textbook had prepared her for. A man could shatter every dream with just one backhanded slap. After 7 years of surviving, she escaped one night with her baby girl. She ran to Seattle. She didn't run to chase dreams. She ran to survive. But fate has crueler stories. Her daughter died in a traffic accident at just 4 years old. Valerie lost everything. Everyone. She applied for the lowest paying job in the hospital night shift janitor. Strangely enough, it was in those late night hallways with only the beeping of heart monitors and the hush of sleeping children, that she found something life had stolen presence. Valerie didn't talk much. She listened. She moved softly. And she remembered. She remembered the child who loved the smell of clean linens. She remembered the girl who flinched at the sound of the blood pressure cuff. She remembered the sobs that echoed in the dark, when no one else was around. And she remembered Noah, the boy who never slept, who hid under the bed every time she came in. At first, Valerie didn't approach. She simply placed a soft towel near his bed and walked away. Night 2, she left a dinosaur sticker. Night 3, a flashlight shaped like the moon. On the 4th night, Noah crawled out from under the bed. She smiled gently. "You don't have to talk. Just sit." "I'm not going anywhere." He sat, silent. But he stayed. From that night on, Valerie lingered longer in Noah's room. She never asked, never pushed. She just sat, sometimes reading a book she brought with her, sometimes doodling on napkins and leaving the drawings behind. Noah started falling asleep, sometimes on the chair, sometimes with his head resting gently against her leg, and Valerie would stay frozen, not daring to move, afraid to disturb a peace that had taken 2 years to find. His medical records didn't reflect it. No one charted the change. But Noah started eating more. He said a few words to the nurses. He drew in crayon. Jonathan didn't notice. Didn't know. Not until that night. The night he came back early, opened the door to Noah's room, and saw Valerie lying in bed beside his son. Noah wasn't crying. Wasn't hiding. He was asleep. Asleep like a child should be. Asleep, something Jonathan had failed to give him for 2 long years. And then the anger. It wasn't fear. It wasn't suspicion. It was something far worse. For the first time in his life, Jonathan realized he wasn't the one his son had chosen to feel safe with. And sometimes that hurts more than loss. But you know something? Healing doesn't always come from degrees or titles. Sometimes it comes from the janitor, from the bruised hands, from the shattered heart, and from the quiet kind of courage that chooses to stay. Valerie didn't see it coming. She hadn't expected Jonathan to return before his usual rounds. And she definitely hadn't expected the man she once thought of as a stone statue in a white coat to stand there, body rigid as steel cable, eyes blazing like she was the wound still bleeding in his life. His voice ripped through the room like a gunshot. "What the hell do you think you're doing in my son's bed?" Valerie jolted upright. Noah's head still rested on her chest, his breathing soft, as if one wrong sound would shatter him completely. She didn't flinch, didn't panic. Her hand gently rested on the boy's back, shielding him, keeping him asleep. "He had another episode," she whispered. "He asked me to stay." "Valerie, a janitor," Jonathan shouted. "Not a therapist, not a nurse. You don't belong in this room." Valerie just looked at him. No defense, no apology. She slowly laid Noah down, pulled the small blanket over his chest, and stood. She didn't see the slap coming. It wasn't hard. But it was enough to make her stumble back. The air froze. Valerie lifted her hand to her cheek, not because of pain, but because of the shock and the sorrow. A sorrow so deep it reached through time, down into the roots of memory she'd tried to bury. For a second, she wasn't in the hospital room anymore. She was in an old kitchen. Years ago, the first time a man slapped her for crossing a line, while trying to protect her daughter from his rage. Old wounds don't bleed, but they remember. She didn't speak. She just glanced at Noah, now awake, eyes wide in panic, his lips trembling without sound. Valerie turned away. Holding her soft canvas shoes in one hand, she walked past Jonathan. No begging, no screaming, no need to explain. Just one sentence. "I stayed because no one else did. Not even you." Then she disappeared down the long hallway, leaving behind a father trembling with something far deeper than anger's shame. Noah didn't eat for 3 days after that. He didn't speak, didn't respond to teachers, didn't cooperate with nurses. He just sat in the corner, clutching an old towel Valerie had once left him, curled up like a kitten abandoned in the rain. Jonathan said nothing. He didn't report the incident to the board, didn't launch an investigation. But he didn't look for Valerie either. He told himself he was right, that he was the father, the protector, the one who decided who got close to his son. But Noah's silence was the loudest voice in the room. Jonathan started remembering things he'd missed. Mornings when Noah seemed less agitated. Crayon drawings in the nightstand, showing a woman with curly hair in a gray uniform, smiling. The day Noah wore his slippers on the correct feet. Something Jonathan thought was random. But Noah usually mixed them up. It was Valerie who had taught him the difference. Patiently, quietly. Jonathan had never noticed, because he had never truly seen. That night, cleaning out Noah's nightstand, Jonathan found a folded piece of paper tucked beneath a book. The pencil lines were faint, but clear. When the world gets too loud, remember the quiet between heartbeats. I'm still there. No signature. No decoration. Just shaky words, probably scribbled in a dim hospital room, from someone who had known what loneliness felt like, and chose to stay anyway. Jonathan let go. The paper slipped from his fingers like a breath. That night, for the first time in years, he sat beside his son's bed. Not as a doctor, not as a man in control, but as a father. Noah didn't look at him, but when Jonathan gently touched the towel Valerie had left behind, the boy shifted, rested his head on the pillow, and whispered, "She didn't leave me." 4 words. 4 words that cut deeper than any scalpel. Deeper than the night he signed his wife's death certificate. He had driven away the only person his son had let in. Not because Valerie was wrong, but because she was right. Too right. And that made him feel small. The next morning, Jonathan didn't go to the OR. He canceled 3 conferences, put on a blazer, no white coat. And for the first time, he left the hospital without giving instructions. He knew she worked nights, but he didn't wait. Jonathan drove straight to the women's transitional shelter listed in her employee records. The building was old, 3 stories, paint peeling. Handprints in watercolor covered the front wall, tiny ones made by children. He stood at the front door and took a long breath. "I'm not here as a doctor," he whispered to himself. "I'm here as a father who made a mistake." And for the first time in his life, Jonathan Blake learned how to say, "I'm sorry." Valerie was folding clothes when Jonathan arrived. Not her own, but worn-out hoodies, hand-me, down dresses, and a bag of toddler leggings with holes at the knees. She volunteered to do laundry for the other mothers at the shelter, the ones working double shifts with no time to smooth out shirts for their kids. People say, no one is ever too poor to give. Valerie believed that, whether it was a smile, a nod, or a hug that knew how to stay silent when needed most. When she looked up and saw Jonathan standing in the doorway, paper bag in hand from the bakery near the hospital, she didn't flinch. She wasn't surprised. She wasn't angry. She didn't smile either. She was just still. "What do you want?" she asked, eyes fixed on the last folded shirt. Jonathan hesitated. For the first time in his life, he didn't know how to start a conversation. "I brought you croissants," he said, like a schoolboy late to class, trying to justify it with a lousy excuse. Valerie didn't take them. She didn't invite him in. He stood awkwardly, then sat down on a wooden bench near the clothesline. Chipped paint, one leg wobbly. Not the kind of place meant for tailored suits. "No, won't talk to me," Jonathan said. "He won't eat. He's not drawing anymore." "I know," Valerie replied. "I'm messed up." "I know that, too." Her voice wasn't sarcastic, just honest, like someone who's used to being unheard. After a moment, she sat down beside him, not too close, but close enough to let him breathe. "Who did you think I was?" It wasn't an accusation. It was a door, and she was leaving it open if he had the courage to walk through. "I thought you crossed a line," he said, truthfully. "And I thought I had to control everything to keep my son safe." Valerie nodded slowly. "I didn't cross a line," she said. "I crossed fear. You live in it." Jonathan didn't argue. She looked out at the courtyard, where children were playing in mismatched shoes. "You're a surgeon, right? You fix brains. But people were not just brains. See that curly-haired girl over there? She was left locked in a car for 6 hours on a summer day. Her mom's in therapy now, and the only thing she hugs is a stuffed dog I found in a trash bin." She turned back to him. "I'm not a therapist, Jonathan. I'm just someone who didn't leave." The silence between them deepened. Then she sighed, her voice softer. I saw the fear in your eyes that night. Not fear of me, but fear you weren't enough. Fear of losing your son all over again. Jonathan looked down. He didn't deny it. Didn't try to defend himself. I lost my wife in a crash that I should have prevented. You're still trying to fix everything with your hands. But Noah doesn't need surgery. He needs a hug without a deadline. A presence, without obligation. Can you give him that? That question wasn't for Dr. Jonathan Blake. It was for Jonathan, the father, a man stripped of career, credentials, and status. He didn't answer right away. He just sat there, quiet, peeling off each layer of armor he'd worn for 2 long years. Finally, Valerie stood. If I come back, she said, I won't be a janitor. I won't be a babysitter. I'll be the person Noah trusts. And you won't interfere when I do things my way. Jonathan looked up, nodded once. I agree. And one more thing, she added, eyes steady. I don't need you to make amends with croissants. I need you to show up, every day, not to control, but to relearn how to be a father. Jonathan smiled. For the first time since his wife's funeral. Then will you teach me? He asked. Valerie didn't reply. She simply turned and called over her shoulder, Well, start Sunday. Noah likes pancakes on Sundays. That night, on the 6th floor of Seattle Grace, Jonathan wiped down the table, stacked Noah's books, and rehung the crayon drawings on the wall. He changed the sheets. Found the old blanket Valerie used to cover Noah, the one that still smelled faintly of lavender. Before he left the room, he posted a note on the door. Safe space rules. No yelling. No leaving without goodbye pancakes on Sundays. Jonathan was beginning to understand. Healing doesn't always come from degrees. Sometimes it comes from people with the deepest wounds, because they know how to stay the longest. Sunday. There was no rain, but the sky still wore that heavy, leaden gray that Seattle calls home. Jonathan arrived at the hospital by 5 a.m., not to operate, not for a board meeting, but to cook breakfast. He fumbled over pancake batter in the tiny pediatric ward kitchen, and the faint scent of burnt edges drifted into the halls, making nurses glance at each other and giggle under their breath. Noah still wasn't saying much, but he sat quietly in a booster seat at the table, his legs swinging, hands clutching the old stuffed animal Valerie had once sewn back together. Every now and then, he tilted his head, as if listening for a sound only he could hear. At exactly 6:30, Valerie walked in. Gone was the janitor's uniform. Today she wore a soft cream tee, simple jeans, and a gray scarf loosely draped over her shoulders. She still looked humble, but something about her was different. Not confidence, but the grounded presence of someone who knows her worth and doesn't need anyone to validate it. Noah saw her first. He didn't leap up like most 6-year-olds might, but his eyes lit up, that kind of light only found in those who feel truly safe. No words, no need for them. Valerie stepped forward, leaned down, and pressed her forehead gently to Noah's, a familiar ritual. Noah closed his eyes and took a long, deep breath, like every nightmare that had ever clung to him vanished the moment she touched him. Jonathan stood still, watching, learning how to step back without losing his place as a father. You made pancakes. Valerie asked, raising an eyebrow at the skillet, still billowing smoke. I tried my best, he said sheepishly. I think they're edible with enough syrup. The 3 of them sat together at the table. No one talked much, but it didn't feel awkward. Not because they were close, but because each of them was quietly making space inside themselves for the others to step in, at their own pace. After breakfast, Valerie laid out her conditions. Not like an ultimatum, but like someone setting boundaries so love wouldn't turn into control. If I stay, she said, there are 3 rules. Jonathan nodded. He'd been expecting this. 1. I'm not your employee. I don't take orders. I work for Noah, not for the system. 2. Noah gets to choose me. If one day he doesn't want me anymore, I'll leave. No questions, no bitterness. 3. You must spend at least 2 hours each week with Noah. No phones, no emails, no white coats. Just father and son. Jonathan swallowed, not out of fear, but because those rules were heartbreakingly simple. And not a single one of them was something he'd done before. I agree, he said. I'm not asking you to stay because I feel guilty. I'm asking because I can't replace you. And I don't want to keep failing him. Valerie turned to Noah. Do you agree, sweetheart? Me coming back has to be your decision. Noah looked at her, then at his dad. He nodded slowly, then whispered, Pancakes, every Sunday. The words were barely a breeze, but they hit Jonathan like a wave. Not because of the pancakes, but because Noah, after months of silence, had asked for something. And that something was continuity. That day, Valerie didn't begin with therapy. She helped Noah tidy his room. Together, they drew a tiny map. A safe space map, where every corner, every drawer, every pillow had its own name. The reading nook, Moon Bay. The crayon bun, Jungle Jar. The bedtime blanket, Cloudy Armor. Beside the bed were 2 chairs, one labeled Dad's Seat. The other, Val's Corner. They could never be switched. A rule Noah wrote himself using a dull pencil Valerie once gave him. Valerie didn't prescribe medication. She didn't teach. She didn't fix. She showed up. That evening, she and Jonathan sat together watching Noah draw. Each time Noah picked a color, Valerie would ask, How do you feel when you use this color? And each time, Jonathan learned something new. That emotions weren't problems to solve. They were truths that needed permission to exist. On day 3, Valerie asked to take Noah outside, just 15 minutes to the small garden behind the hospital. Jonathan hesitated, but nodded. Valerie held Noah's hand. He trembled a little, but he didn't pull back. In a garden filled with lavender and wild daisies, Noah sat on a stone bench. Valerie said nothing. She handed him a small glass terrarium. Inside, a moth lay sleeping. It sleeps during the day, she said, because it loves quiet. But at night it flies, and no one ever sees how beautiful it is until the light gets soft enough for it to land. Noah stared at the moth for a long while, then smiled. Valerie didn't heal through technique, she healed through presence. No more, no pressure, no fixing, no forcing, just being there. And sometimes, for a wounded child, that's more than enough. There was no alarm. No urgent knocks on the door like the ones in the surgical wing. But that Monday morning, foggy and quiet in Seattle, marked the true beginning of a new chapter in the lives of 3 people: Jonathan, Noah, and Valerie. Valerie entered Noah's room with a light brown cardboard box. She set it gently on the table in front of him. Noah tilted his head, curious. We're starting a journal, she said softly. Not one with words, but with pictures. We'll call it the memory map. Noah looked at her, then at the box. Inside were colored paper, crayons, round, edged scissors, glue sticks, animal stickers, and a soft-covered, empty notebook. He didn't ask anything. He didn't resist. He simply reached for the green crayon, the one he always used, and began to draw. The first page showed a tree with no leaves, but the roots were bold and thick. Valerie smiled. How do you feel when you draw this tree? Noah thought for a while, then whispered, No one waters it, but it still tries to grow. The words hit Jonathan, standing silently in the corner, like a wave. He was pulled back to that final night in the ICU, when he clutched his wife's hand and promised to keep everything going. But in the 2 years since, what had he really kept going? Besides the silence, Valerie never pushed Noah to draw every day. She simply showed up, sat down, laid out the supplies, opened the notebook, and waited. Some days, Noah drew rain. Other days, he sketched himself sleeping beside a giant stuffed bear. There were days he only drew a blank circle. No colors, no shapes. Then closed the notebook and said nothing. That's silence, Valerie told Jonathan. And sometimes, silence is the full story. Jonathan began to understand. He stopped asking Noah, Are you happy today? Or, Why won't you say anything? Instead, he started sitting beside him, never across, and simply saying, Do you want to color with me? No more adult monologues. No more attempts to fix the child. Just presence. Unconditional. Without agenda. One afternoon, Valerie said, We should make some house rules. Jonathan raised an eyebrow. Noah's a bit young for rules, don't you think? Valerie shook her head. Not rules. Boundaries. And when a child gets to help create boundaries, they learn they have the right to say no. So the 3 of them sat down at the table. Valerie held the pen. Noah colored the title in red, Rules for Safe Space. Here's what they wrote, not in logical order, but in emotional order. No yelling, ask before touching, laughing aloud. You can say, stop, and people must listen. Blankets are not for stealing. If someone cries, sit beside them, don't ask why. Drawing time is private. Dad can ask to join, but he has to knock. Pancake days are sacred. No phones during hugs. Jonathan was speechless as he read them. What seemed like childlike rules were really a mirror, reflecting everything Noah had once lacked. The right to say no. The right to stay quiet. The right to not be fixed. The right to have a voice. Valerie turned to Jonathan. We don't have to say, I'm proud of you, all the time. But we do have to say, I hear you. And prove it with what we do. 1 week later, Jonathan brought a small wooden box to Noah's room. It's called the listening box, he said. If you don't want to talk, you can leave a note in here. Valerie smiled. She knew. He was trying, in his own way. Noah began to write little notes. Today was too loud. I wanted to scream but didn't. I miss Mom, but I like pancakes too. Dad sat beside me today. That was nice. Jonathan read every note. He didn't respond immediately. He didn't probe. He just left his own note inside. I'm here, whenever you're ready. One evening, Valerie made a suggestion. Let Noah be your therapist today. A Noah would ask the questions. Jonathan had to answer, honestly. No deflection. Noah thought for a long time, then asked, Are you scared? Jonathan paused. Scared of what? Buddy, that I won't love you anymore. Jonathan lowered his head, then nodded. Yes, I've been scared, many times, but today I'm not, because now I know. Love is something you learn, not something you demand. Valerie said nothing, but her tears hit the table, not from pain, but because, finally, the father was beginning to understand. Healing doesn't come with fireworks. It doesn't arrive with a grand return to normal. It shows up quietly, in tiny moments when someone chooses to stay. When a child feels heard, and when a father learns, he doesn't have to fix everything. He just has to be there. Valerie always woke up early, not because her job demanded it, but because sleep was the most fragile thing she had. A place where memories came uninvited, like a flood breaking through the cracks. And in her deepest dreams, there was always a boy named Liam. Liam was her son, the only child she had ever carried in her body, and lost in a way no mother should ever have to imagine, silently taken from her arms, absorbed into the foster system, and swallowed by something people coldly called procedure. Valerie was 26 that year, a senior in child psychology, with dreams of becoming an early intervention specialist for trauma-affected kids. She believed, fiercely, that if adults would just listen sooner and more patiently, children wouldn't have to grow up with scars carved into their hearts. She had been happy once. Even though her husband, Mark, was controlling, Valerie believed, if I'm gentle enough, patient enough, things will stay calm. But over time, that silence became a trap. Mark started yelling, then smashing things, then slapping her. Once, then twice, then so often she couldn't remember when it all began. Valerie endured it, not because she was weak, but because she thought Liam needed a complete family. Until one night, she heard Liam crying behind the bathroom door, and realized the sound of breaking glass didn't come from her hand. That night, she fled, in the rain, no shoes, no wallet, just a bottle of formula and a crumpled birth certificate. They stayed at a women's shelter for 9 days. On the 10th, Mark filed a report accusing her of child abuse. Police, medical staff, and social workers arrived unannounced. Liam, only 4 years old, was taken away. For environmental safety assessment, Valerie pleaded. She begged. She presented every piece of evidence she had, bruises on her arms, reports from the shelter, her academic transcripts, and glowing recommendations from her university. But the system didn't care about context. It only cared about protocol. Liam was placed in temporary foster care. Valerie was promised weekly visitation. But appointments were delayed, then rescheduled, then unavailable due to internal reasons. She didn't see Liam for 2 months. And then, on a late winter night, the phone rang. The voice on the other end, shaky, from a caseworker, said, "We're deeply sorry. Liam had a high fever for 3 days. The guardian didn't take him to the hospital in time. By the time they arrived, his heart had already stopped. Valerie fell into a bottomless pit. She didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't smash anything. She just sat, for days, like someone whose soul had been scraped clean from the inside. Friends urged her to sue, but the foster system had lawyers. They could say Liam had pre-existing conditions, even though he'd never once been hospitalized. They could hide the delays. They could bury every attempt at truth, from a nameless, grieving single mother. Valerie let go of her dream to be a child psychologist. She couldn't heal others when she hadn't even relearned how to breathe. 3 years later, she arrived in Seattle. No academic record, no letters of reference. She applied to be a janitor at the children's hospital, not for the paycheck, but for the only purpose she had left. No child should ever be silenced the way Liam was. She worked night shifts, because that's when doctors were exhausted, nurses were spread thin, and scared little patients jolted awake from nightmares to find no one left with energy to hold them. Valerie stayed, not because she was assigned to, but because she understood what it felt like to be terrified and unheard. Then came Noah. He feared bright lights. He recoiled from touch. And in his sleep, he often whispered, "Don't leave me." Valerie didn't intervene. She simply made sure her eyes were the first thing he saw whenever he opened his own in the middle of the night. She learned to walk barefoot so she wouldn't wake him. She left little notes under his pillow. "I'm still here." She did all the things she had once wished someone had done for Liam. That night, when Jonathan asked her, "Why don't you ask for more? You could be a certified therapist," Valerie answered, "I once had a child. I once wanted to be someone so I could protect him." But it turns out what mattered most was being in the right place at the right time and not turning away. Jonathan didn't respond. He quietly poured her another cup of tea, not to comfort her, but because now he understood. Valerie didn't need pity. She needed an ally, not to change the world, but to make sure that kind of tragedy never happened again to any other child. It was a March afternoon, just as the lavender by the hospital windowsill had begun to bloom, when Valerie received the court summons. No warning, no heads up, just a thin envelope, white paper, cold typewritten letters, and a name that lodged itself in her throat: Claudia Hastings, the sister of Jonathan's late wife. Noah's biological aunt. Valerie stood still as she read the contents: an official petition for temporary guardianship of Noah Blake, citing Jonathan Blake for entrusting his child to an unqualified individual with no professional credentials and a vague psychological history. At the bottom of the letter, a line chilled her: "We request that Ms. Valerie Mason appear in court to testify and provide her criminal record and employment file." She folded the letter. Her hands shook, not because she was afraid for herself, but because she knew, once the past was unearthed, the name, Liam Mason, would be called before the public. Jonathan found out a few hours later. He didn't yell. He didn't panic. He just looked at Valerie for a long moment and asked, "What are you most afraid of right now?" Valerie didn't answer. Outside the window, a breeze flipped open one of Noah's hand-drawn journal pages. A sketch of a woman and a boy sitting under a tree. Next to it, scribbled in red crayon, "No yelling. No leaving. Only staying," she whispered. "I'm afraid of losing him again. I'm afraid people won't see what I've done, only what I've lived through." Claudia showed up at the hospital 3 days later, with her own attorney and eyes as cold as polished granite. She didn't greet Noah. She didn't acknowledge Jonathan. She dropped a copy of the court summons on the desk and said, sharp as broken glass, "I do not permit a janitor, someone with no blood relation, to be around my nephew every single day. She's not a therapist. She's not licensed. And she already failed to protect her own child." Valerie stood in the hallway. She heard every word. She didn't flinch. She didn't explain. She just clenched her fists, tight enough not to cry. The hearing took place the following Friday, in a small courtroom at King County Family Court. Claudia's side presented their case. Valerie had no biological connection to Noah. She had lost custody of her own child in the past. She had no certification in psychology, therapy, or special education. Jonathan allowing her daily access to Noah was a breach of medical ethics and an abuse of power over a minor. Valerie was called to the stand. She walked up. No lawyer, just her eyes. Clear, calm, unshaking. She spoke, "I'm not here to fight. I have no attorney. I hold no degrees. But I have one thing. I stayed when no one else did." She paused, looked the judge in the eye. "I've mopped the floors of this hospital for 5 years. And night after night, when everyone else had gone home, I sat beside Noah. Not for money, not for duty. I sat because I know what it feels like to wake up afraid and find no one there. I sat so he wouldn't become another Liam." The courtroom went still. Not a breath. Jonathan was called next. But he didn't wait. He stepped forward. "No notes. No permission needed. I'm the chief of neurosurgery. I perform over 200 procedures a year. I've authored dozens of peer-reviewed studies and hold 3 advanced degrees." He paused. "And I failed my son." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. But he didn't waver. A sigh tried to do everything right. Right by the book. Right by protocol. But what Valerie did for Noah, no professor, no licensed therapist ever could. She didn't fix him. She didn't intervene. She stayed. And in a world where kids are processed like clinical cases, sometimes just one person who chooses to stay can change a child's life. He turned to Claudia. "I know you're Noah's aunt, but blood doesn't make a safe space. And if I have to choose between family and the woman who pulled my son out of the dark, I choose the one who kept the light in his eyes." The judge looked down at the case file, then at Valerie, then at Noah, sitting in the hallway between them, holding a crayon drawing of 3 stick figures, 1 tall, 2 smaller, and the words written in shaky print, "My family is who stays." The legal battle wasn't over. But justice doesn't always side with degrees. Sometimes it lives in the quiet presence of someone who chooses to stay and never walk away. Some trials don't reveal the truth through a lawyer's defense or the monotone recitation of legal statutes by a judge. Sometimes the truth is told through a drawing, made with crayons on a slightly wrinkled A3 sheet of paper. And in this story, it was Noah who took the witness stand, not with words, but with art. The final hearing, before the judge would render her decision, took place on a quiet morning, sunlight streaming through the courthouse window, as if washing the room clean from the heavy air of all the days before. Noah sat between Jonathan and Valerie, clutching a rolled-up drawing tied with a blue ribbon, his favorite color. When the judge asked if he had anything he wanted to share, Noah looked up and slowly nodded. Then, with small, trembling hands, but unwavering resolve, he untied the ribbon, unrolled the drawing, and held it high with both hands. The entire courtroom fell silent. The picture showed a small house. 3 people stood on the porch, a brown-haired man, with a stethoscope sticker on his shirt, a woman in a dress with curly hair, next to a carefully drawn mop, and a little boy hugging a yellow teddy bear. Above the house, in large, messy but clear handwriting, it read, "Lus Ufli, Letties Oath of a G," a below that were tiny symbols, a heart, a smiley face, and a blank circle, the symbol Valerie had taught Noah to use whenever he felt safe. The judge leaned forward. Her eyes were slightly red. "Noah," she asked gently, "whose house is that?" Noah didn't answer right away. He turned to look at Jonathan, then at Valerie, and finally, straight toward Claudia, sitting stiffly on the petitioner's bench, clutching her expensive handbag. "It's my house," he said softly, "where nobody leaves me behind." That day, no further testimony was needed. The court denied Claudia's petition for guardianship. Jonathan retained full custody of Noah, and Valerie was officially recognized as Noah's emotional guardian, a title not found in any legal handbook, but handwritten in bold ink by the judge herself, with the note, "Sometimes, the people without credentials are the ones who keep a child's soul intact." 2 days later, the story appeared in the hospital's internal blog under a section called, "What Medicine Can't Measure." A junior editor shared it on a pediatric care forum. From there, it spread, like a warm ember in the middle of a cold Seattle winter. Hundreds, then thousands of shares. Comments poured in, from nurses, doctors, parents, and adults who had once been silent children in the cold corners of hospital wards. One wrote, "I used to be that quiet kid in a hospital bed. If I'd had a Valerie, I wouldn't have spent 15 years in therapy just to learn how to trust someone." A geriatric physician added, "Medical school taught me how to heal bodies. But people like Valerie, they teach us how to heal something even more vital: emotions." A few weeks later, the hospital board summoned Jonathan. To his surprise, not to reprimand him for breaching patient protocol, but to propose a new initiative, a non-clinical emotional care program for pediatric patients, inspired by the story of Noah and Valerie. And they wanted Valerie to co-found it, to lead its development. Jonathan smiled. He had only one request. Don't call it an intervention program. Call it the Safe House Project. On the day the first office opened, Valerie walked into a space that no longer smelled of antiseptic, no harsh white walls, no hospital charts. Instead, the scent of watercolor, crayons, picture books, and soft pillows. On the wall hung Noah's first drawing, the safe house. Beneath it, hand-stitched on fabric, were the words, "No yelling, no leaving, just staying." Jonathan walked over, handing her a folder. "Starting today, you're the executive director. I'm stepping back. I'll only show up if the floors need mopping or pancakes need flipping." Valerie laughed. A real laugh, the kind she hadn't felt in years. She was no longer the grieving mother who had lost a child. No longer the invisible janitor in a sterile white building. She was now the gatekeeper for every child who had ever been hurt. And from this day forward, no child would ever have to face that fear alone. Because in the end, a house doesn't need a roof. It doesn't need an address. It doesn't even need blood ties. It just needs someone who chooses to stay. Late spring in Seattle wasn't as dazzling as people imagined. Rain still came and went, soft as breath, but enough to leave someone's hair a tangled mess as they stepped out of the hospital. Valerie stood under the awning, holding a cup of hot ginger tea. Out in the courtyard, Jonathan was digging a small hole. The rain had just stopped. The soil was damp, the scent of freshly cut grass mixed with the lingering smell of rain. A young lavender plant sat beside him, waiting to be planted. "You even know how to plant lavender?" Valerie asked, half teasing, half serious. Jonathan looked up at her, one side of his white coat streaked with mud. "No," he said. "But I do know it thrives where there's light and not too many words." Valerie didn't respond. She simply stepped forward, touched his hand, didn't grip it, just placed hers lightly on top. And together, they lowered the plant into the earth. Beneath that lavender sat a small wooden sign, hand-carved with words only a few would fully understand. "To the woman who made silence safe again. The woman who turned silence into sanctuary. The woman who taught a frightened child how to laugh again, and taught a man who'd forgotten how to feel. How to listen." No one said the words love. No one reached for a long embrace or stole a kiss in the rain. No one said "I love you." No one claimed each other. Instead, Valerie and Jonathan did something neither of them had ever done well before. They stayed. They didn't become some fairy tale couple. They didn't get engaged. Didn't move in together. Didn't host Sunday dinners. But every Saturday morning, they went to the farmer's market with Noah. And every Sunday night, they read a chapter of a book. Valerie reading aloud, Jonathan doing silly voices, and Noah holding a pillow while sketching the illustrations. Noah, the boy who once sat silent in the corner of a hospital room, now filled entire hallways with laughter. He wasn't always okay. There were still nightmares. Still moments when loud noises made him flinch. But now, he knew what to do: retreat to the safe spot, corner in his room, grab his crayons, draw. One day, Valerie found a bundle of papers in his room, tied with a piece of string. On the cover, written in green crayon, "THELUITHQU hence," written and illustrated by Noah Blake. Noah hid his face under a pillow when she discovered it. Valerie gently opened the first page. There was a drawing of a woman mopping a hospital floor, next to a little boy sleeping. The next page showed them sitting under a tree, with a teddy bear between them. The last page was a small house with a sign on the door, "Unolilinged," Los Oaflaugent. Stay away. Jonathan decided to turn it into a real book. He used the prize money from a recent medical award to hire a local publisher and printed 500 copies, free, for children undergoing treatment at the hospital. The book became a small phenomenon, not because of its writing, not because of the art, but because it came from a child who once lived in fear and rewrote his story the way he wished it had always been. At a hospital conference a few weeks later, the director of pediatric therapy stood at the podium and said, "When we talk about compassionate medicine, we often think of prescriptions, protocols, teams of specialists. But sometimes all it takes is someone with a mop who knows when to pause and listen. That's how you save a soul." Valerie sat in the last row. She said nothing. Jonathan turned and smiled at her. And Noah, he was in the back, signing his first printed books with slanted handwriting. "Love, Noah. Stay safe." That June, Jonathan planted 2 more lavender roots. Next to the original plaque, he carved a new line, 3 roots, 1 house. No yelling. Valerie placed a small wooden wind chime beside it, so that every time the breeze passed, its soft music would remind them healing isn't loud. It isn't grand. It's one person choosing to stay, another choosing to trust, and a child allowed to keep dreaming. No one knew what lay ahead. Jonathan was still a doctor, still exhausted during peak seasons. Valerie continued to run the Safe House project, now with 2 volunteers. Noah grew a little every day, still asking, "Valerie's staying, right?" And always getting the same answer, "Not just staying, sweet boy. I'll always keep the door open." And that's how a home was built, in the middle of a storm. Not from bricks, not from blood, not from addresses, but from one sacred promise: I won't leave. Valerie never imagined she'd be standing in front of a room full of nurses, let alone holding a microphone and opening with the question, "Have you ever thought that silence could be a form of therapy?" The room stayed quiet for a few seconds. Then one hand went up, then a nod. The first training session of the Safe House method, a non-clinical but deeply humane initiative, officially began that Monday morning at Seattle Children's Hospital. Valerie wasn't wearing a white coat. She didn't use slides or graphs. Just a small notebook, a few pieces of colored paper, and a drawing by Noah. The content was simple, but it went straight to the heart. No jargon, no complex charts, just a real story of a janitor who lost a child, a doctor who lost connection, and a boy who used to speak no words at all. Valerie taught them how to create a quiet safety space, not with a separate room, but with a gentle gaze and a hand that doesn't push. She taught how to read panic when it's wordless. And most importantly, how to stay without trying to fix. The phrase she repeated over and over, "Not every wound needs fixing. Some just need to be witnessed." Soon, nearby hospitals began requesting pilot trainings. Valerie started traveling, Tacoma, Portland boys, and in every place she didn't teach theory. She shared experience. She brought nose drawings. She played a voice recording of the lady with quiet hands. She let the nurses feel it for themselves. And everywhere, just like in Seattle, people went silent. Not because they hadn't seen hurt children before, but because they had never been given the tools to love without invading. Meanwhile, Noah started school again, after nearly a year off for healing. On his first day, Valerie walked beside him, her hand gently holding his. Jonathan stopped the car, opened the door and said, "If you're scared, just say so. But if you're okay, tell a story." Noah nodded and walked through the gates. 1 week later, Valerie received an email from his teacher. "Noah asked to be our morning storyteller. He doesn't talk much, but he draws beautifully. And when he shares emotions through pictures, the whole class goes quiet." From then on, every Wednesday, Noah became the emotion captain of his classroom, guiding his peers through feelings like anger, anxiety, joy, and silence. He never said more than 20 words at a time, but he always brought his drawings. And every time he unrolled one, another child found a piece of themselves in it. One evening, as Valerie was folding laundry, Noah walked in with a stack of blank paper and said, "Miss Valerie, can we build a big project?" She looked up, surprised. "How big?" Noah laid out a hand-drawn diagram on the table with arrows, circles, and stickers. "A Safe spot, building a website, kid storytellers. Adults who know how to stay quiet. He called it the Quiet Project. Valerie laughed, then cried. She and Jonathan stayed up for nights planning. They invited artists, therapists, teachers to join. The project would connect children who had been hurt by grief, divorce, emotional neglect, with caregivers, not through talk, through art. Each child would receive a quiet box filled with crayons, a blank storybook, a paper bracelet that said, "Today I feel dogadalo." Adults were trained to respond without words. They could draw back, or simply place a hand on the table, nothing more. Every child caregiver pair would build an emotion house together and display it at a community exhibit. 6 months in, the Quiet Project was present in 8 states. In just the first year, it connected over 3,000 children and more than 200 adults. No machines, no meds, just paper, color, and someone willing to stay. One day, at a local art exhibit, Valerie stood next to Noah, now nearly shoulder height. He pointed to a framed piece on the wall. A quiet circle surrounded by multicolored dots like a tiny universe. "I drew that," Noah said. "It's called Silent Universe." "Why a universe?" He smiled. "Because quiet space is where feelings fly the farthest." Valerie looked at him, not the silent boy from a hospital corner anymore. She saw a guide, a storyteller, a living reminder that when we pause long enough, stay quiet long enough, we don't just hear children. We finally hear ourselves. And from a hospital corner, a small room and a soft lavender plant by the window, a dream of healing, wordless, unforced, and quietly powerful, had begun to spread. Not everyone needs fixing. Some people just need to be heard. And sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is stay. We live in a world obsessed with urgency. Rush to succeed, rush to speak, rush to fix, even things that were never broken. In that world, people often ask, how do you heal a child? How do you pull someone out of their pain? How do you help them get better? But few stop to ask, how do you listen without interfering? Stay without controlling? Love without turning into a burden? Valerie, a woman who once mopped hospital floors with hands still trembling from losing her child, gave us an answer, not through textbooks, not through titles, but through presence wrapped in silence. She didn't try to treat Noah. She didn't try to fix him. She simply stayed, night after night, holding the quiet until he felt safe enough to speak. Listening sometimes is the deepest form of love. No advice needed, no special skills required, just the willingness to sit down, close, and let someone know they matter enough to be honored with silence. The journey of Valerie, Jonathan, and Noah also reminds us healing doesn't only come from those called professionals. You don't need a degree to be a healer. You don't need a certificate to be trusted. You just need a heart patient enough and a soul humble enough not to make someone else's story about you. And above all, this story teaches us about family. Not every family begins with blood. Not everyone who gave you life knows how to stay. Not everyone who raised you knows how to listen. Sometimes, true family is made of those who chose to stay. When everything was falling apart, a woman who quietly sits by a hospital bed after her shift. A doctor relearning how to be a father. A boy who once feared his own voice, now teaching a class about feelings through the art born of his pain. And you. Have you ever stayed beside someone without trying to change them? Have you ever sat in silence with a hurting child without needing all the answers? Have you ever been someone's Valerie simply by being patient? If you have, then you already know. Healing doesn't come from urgency, but from presence. Not from loud words, but from respected quiet. Not from perfect people, but from those brave enough to stay. Share this story if you've ever been the one who stayed, or if someone once stayed for you. Subscribe to Voices in the Dark for more stories of presence, forgiveness, and the quiet power of patience. And if you're a parent, caregiver, educator, or simply someone learning to listen, discover more about the Quiet Project. Because sometimes, the kindest thing you can do for someone is to not walk away